professor Anthony Vidler per introdurre la lezione che ha preparato per Mantova Architettura 2020 non è un'impresa semplice. Bisogna cominciare dalla sua patria, l'Inghilterra, dove consegue la laurea in architettura presso l'Università di Cambridge e poi passare la manica per approdare all'Università Tecnica di Delft, dove ottiene il dottorato in storia e teoria, prima di lasciare l'Europa per gli Stati Uniti d'America. Dal 1965 al 1993 Vidler insegna alla scuola di architettura della Princeton University, dove è direttore del Program in European Cultural Studies. Nel 1993 assume la carica di professore e direttore del Dipartimento di Storia dell'Arte della University of California di Los Angeles e dal 2001 al 2013 è preside della Scuola di Architettura della Cooper Union di New York, raccogliendo l'eredità di John Ledoux, storico e critico dell'architettura moderna e contemporanea, con una speciale attenzione rivolta alle vicende dell'architettura francese dall'Illuminismo ad oggi. Svolge attività didattica e di ricerca presso la Cooper Union. Grande conoscitore dell'opera di Claude-Nicolas Ledoux, Anthony Vidler ha realizzato l'allestimento delle saline reali di Ancien e ha curato la mostra Ledoux e le Lumière. Da sempre Vidler affianca alla ricerca storica un lavoro paziente di critica operativa che lo ha portato nel corso degli anni a confrontarsi con l'architettura contemporanea, con un particolare interesse verso le figure di Aldo Rossi e James Stirling. Tra i numerosi libri di Anthony Vidler voglio ricordare The Writing on the Walls, Architectural Theory in the Late Enlightenment del 1987, Claude-Nicolas Ledoux, Architecture and Social Reform at the Hand of Ancien Regime del 1990 e The Architectural Uncanny, Essays in the Modern Unhomely del 1992. Per Mantova Architettura 2020, Anthony Vidler terrà una lezione sul dialogo tra spazio architettonico e spazio dell'arte tra XVIII e XX secolo. Ci mostrerà alcuni casi esemplari di architetti e artisti che nella rappresentazione dell'architettura hanno saputo costruire una teoria del progetto, rivelando sovrapposizioni ed influenze reciproche che rendono labili i confini delle due discipline, con risultati spesso entusiasmanti. Partendo dall'enunciato attribuito al Correggio ed io anche son pittore, ripreso da Étienne-Louis Boullé, passando per le incisioni piranesiane e quelle di Ledoux, Anthony Vidler ci guiderà attraverso un percorso che dall'alba dell'Illuminismo si spinge fino al romanticismo e poi ancora oltre, verso il contemporaneo, con l'idea di architettura di Aldo Rossi. Un'idea in cui ritroviamo le radici di quella città analoga fatta di frammenti di memorie e dove, con un evidente orgoglio, leggiamo anche le tracce della città di Mantova, che Aldo Rossi poeticamente definisce metafora ultima e scelta di un progetto meridionale di questa patria padana. Ringraziando il professor Anthony Vidler per la sua disponibilità, gli cedo quindi la parola con l'augurio di poterlo ospitare presto qui a Mantova.
Thank you so much, Professore. I'm very happy to be back in Italy at this moment, even though it's a virtual visit. My love of Italy started when I was in high school, visit to Venice, and then a long collaboration with Manfredo Tafuri and long friendships with Italian architects Aldo Rossi and all his generation, and many stays in Italy and lectures there. If all had been well, I would have been in Mantua at this moment, but now, of course, we are all locked down in our own cities. and I wish you all safe, and I wish you all very well. So this morning, I want to follow the theme of Professor's course on the question of painting and architecture, on the question of representation and architecture, and talk about the relationships that architects have had. Most of the architects I will be talking about will be in the 18th and early 19th century, but the theme that I wish to stress throughout, which is a theme I stress in teaching architecture, which is drawing, painting, working in 3 dimensions in the arts, is an essential characteristic of architectural design. All the most successful architects I know have been painters, have been sculptors, have been interested in a whole range of techniques of representation, including the contemporary architects who are now experimenting more and more with representation in computerization. So I will try to be clear. Some of the texts that I've placed on the slides are in Italian for you to read more clearly. And if I do not make myself clear, please make your questions on chat so that at the end of this lecture, Professor Baori and myself can begin to respond to your questions. So again, I'm very happy to be with you, and only sorry that I can't see you in person. So of course, the first moment where architecture and representation coincided together in a very fundamental way was, of course, the emergence of ways of representing perspective in the Renaissance. And I give you the diagram of Alberti when in his discussion of painting, developed the Principe della Costruzione Legittima on Alberti, where he is showing the way in which he began to work out the different proportional systems that were possible in geometrical perspective. And of course, this had an immediate impact on his own architecture and much of the Renaissance architecture. You can see that immediately facades in the Renaissance are in fact designed in order to be seen in prospettiva, in perspective. And you can also begin to see that the city itself, in these 3 very celebrated paintings from Urbino, Berlin, and Baltimore, 3 paintings which I think all were done in Urbino in the very early 16th century, around 1500. We don't know who painted them, but they are representations of the classic city with its monuments, the religious city with its temple, and the mercantile city with its port. And so we have the 3 ideal cities of the Renaissance, all constructed according to perspective, and we know that all the way through to the Baroque and into the 19th century with Haussmann, perspective became one of the major instruments of constructing cities, constructing city views, and constructing city pathways and boulevards in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th, and even the 20th century. The relationship between architecture and painting is very strong, of course. From the painter's point of view, we have a whole series of paintings by Poussin, who in fact copied most of his architectural inventions from Palladio's unbuilt works. And so we see here in the painting where he is describing the ashes of a classical hero being collected by his widow, a temple that was not built by Palladio, but actually drawn in Palladio's book, which is completely reproduced in Poussin's painting. So we have a very strong relationship, as we do also with Canaletto here, who is developing a fantasia of Venezia, a fantasy of Venice, producing in Venetian context the fantasy of the building of Palladio's unbuilt project for the Rialto Bridge, together with the basilica and palazzi that actually Palladio had built in Vicenza. So moving in a fantasy-like way, the buildings of Palladio into a dreamlike vision of Venice as it would have been had Palladio built it. This is a fantasy vision that appealed enormously to a number of architects through the 19th and 20th century. It became one of the primary images of the what he called the architettura analoga, the analogous architecture of Aldo Rossi. And we'll be talking a little bit about Aldo Rossi's fascination with the 18th century and its images and its architectural representation in a moment. And here we have one of the first images I want to show you of the different ways in which architecture becomes represented by artists. This, of course, is a painting, and this, of course, is an etching. Etching is a technique, as you know, which is worked on a copper plate with acid that eats away where wax has not been applied and allows for the incision in the plate. Sometimes etchings are supplemented with engraving tools in the way that someone like Piranesi will use both etching and engraving on the same copper plate. Here is a quote that I took in English from an art historian speaking about Piranesi's relationship between etching and engraving. He used both burin. Burin is the sharp tool that scratches the copper, and etching, the needle that allows for the wax to be taken off and the acid to eat into the copper, and scratch lines of every depth and width, while the burnisher was used to soften lines and create lighter patches. He created areas of gray throughout the plate by means of shallow surface scratches that held a light film of ink. In other places, he applied acid directly to the plate in order to roughen it, resulting in scattered black spots. The brightest highlight of these prints has been achieved by adding a resistant ground to an isolated spot before inking the plate. The ground covers any etched lines in that area, as well as accidental scratches, so that the area prints a pure white in the midst of a wide range of blacks and grays. An extraordinary technique that, of course, allows him to develop. Here is the copper plate on above the screen, and the print from that copper plate on the bottom of the screen in a series of etchings which illustrate views of Rome and, of course, the extraordinary fantasies of the carceri, or prisons, that he developed between the 1750s and the 1770s, where he will use one plate. This is the first version of his carceri engraving. He will take the same plate and then rework it very powerfully in order to make it much denser, much deeper, and much more dramatic. And so we have two versions of the invented prisons, the Carceri Invenzione by Giovanni Battista Piranesi, and the way in which these particular techniques of engraving and etching led to the possibility of a sense of atmosphere. Now here we will be talking about questions of atmosphere throughout the the talk. I want to talk about atmosphere that was suggested in the carceri of Piranesi, which became extraordinarily popular, were printed and distributed throughout Europe, and especially popular in France. And we'll be talking about the way in which the atmosphere of these prisons, the atmosphere of, here is the first state of one of the most famous etchings of the prisons, and here is the second state as it is reworked and reworked. These are, of course, impossible environments. There is a wonderful essay by Manfredo Tafuri early in his work, The Sfero e il Labirinto, where he talks about the relationship between these two states of the carceri, the first and the second, and the impossibility of the perspectives within these states. You can actually trace through each of these states a whole series of different perspective views, a whole different sets of viewpoints, so that there is never one single viewpoint. All viewpoints are fractured and broken as these prisons fall apart in the vision of Piranesi, who is, of course, very supportive of the prison reform, the prison reforms of Beccaria and Voltaire in the 1750s and 1760s, and to a certain extent is giving us a sense of the falling apart of the carceral system, a system, of course, which Michel Foucault has developed to great effect in his book Surveiller et Punir of 1974. So now we come to the first architect that I wish to talk about. I'll be talking about 3 or 4 architects, each of whom have a different relationship to painting, have a different relationship to representation. I'll be talking about Etienne Louis Boulet, who has a very powerful relationship to the notion of painting. I'll be talking about Claude-Nicolas Ledoux, who has an equally powerful relationship to the notion of engraving. And we will see that Boulet, who always wants to be a painter, and Ledoux, who was trained to be an engraver, have developed very different architectures out of their forms of representation. So I want to, in a way, suggest that the form of representation that is selected by an architect is a very, very powerful determinant of the architecture of that particular architect. So Boulet, who was one of the earliest professionals in Paris, trained in the school of Blondel in the middle of the 18th century, he did not want to be an architect. He always wanted to be a painter. In fact, he tried, his father was an architect, and his father did not want him to be a painter. He thought that if Boulet became a painter, he would not make any money, and he wanted his son to go into a proper trade, like architecture, where he would make some money and be a proper professional. Boulet always tried to be a painter. He actually worked in the studios of many of the painters, Hubert Robert and others, painters of the 1740s and 1750s, before he was forced by his father to enter architectural school. He left behind at his death in the just after the French Revolution in the 1790s, an essay which he never published. He circulated it among his friends, but he never published it. It was published for the first time in the 20th century and translated by none other than the architect Aldo Rossi, who found in it a particular way of thinking about architecture that stimulated his ability to criticize the functionalism of modern architecture in the 1920s and 1930s. And we'll be talking about that a little bit in the moment. But the question I want to raise is, here we have Aldo Rossi in the 1970s translating Boulez. And if you look at the front page of Boulez, where he calls it architecture, but essay on the art of architecture, not necessarily for him on the function of architecture, but the art of architecture. And underneath, he places an epigraph, ed io anche son pittore, an epigraph that was taken from a famous saying by the Baroque painter Antonio da Correggio. And I also am a painter. So Boulez never wanted to be mistaken just for an architect. He hardly built anything, but presented his work in painting after painting after painting. This is what Rossi says about Boulez. Boulez is not simply an 18th century Enlightenment rationalist. He is an exalted rationalist. Esalto, for Rossi, means that Boulez tried to bring the theme of architecture to an experienced level where the emotions that the architecture provoked, given the subject of the architecture, were very perceptible in the architecture itself. And you can see in this quotation from Boulez, his essay Architettura saggio sull'arte, you can see exactly what he preferred. He would have wanted to be a painter. O quanto è preferibile la sorte dei pittori e degli uomini di lettere. Libri e senza dispendenza alcuna esse possono seguire tutti i loro soggetti e seguire l'impulso del loro genio. Excuse my unpracticed Italian, but that's as far as I will go. But you can read the rest of it. But what he is saying is that painters are so much more free, are so much more liberal and open than architects. Architects are obliged a farne sacrificio per poter essere conosciuto dalle persone al potere. So architects are always obliged to fall under the powers of the client, whereas painters can develop in their paintings l'immagine sublime. And it's that word, sublime, sublime, that I want to follow through in Boulez, because it becomes the word, the key word for his architecture. He is trying to emulate the painters that can begin to develop a kind of imaginative sublime, and that word in that moment in the 1850s and in the 1750s and 1760s was an incredibly powerful word. It was a powerful word in the sense that painters were beginning to experience and experiment with the effects of emotion. Here, the teacher of Boulez, Jean-Baptiste Pierre, Boulez worked in his atelier for several years, showing two things. One, the effect and emotions of age, and the effects and emotions created by light, by chiaroscuro. The development of this notion of the sublime by Boulez then becomes a question of how to illustrate the powers of science, which had been in the Enlightenment developed by scientists, and especially scientists like Newton, who had, of course, developed the theory of gravitational attraction, the tipping of the axis of the Earth, and Boulez wished to develop a kind of monument, which at the same time was a very didactic teaching monument, a cenotaph to Newton, Spirito sublimo, genio vasto e profondo, essere divino, Newton, Newton. And so, con la vestita del tuoi lumi alla sublimità del tuo genio hai tu determinate la figura della terra. And so, in order to celebrate Newton, Boulez, as you can see in this text, and which I will show you in the drawing, developed a vast project for a monument in the shape of the Earth, a complete sphere, which, as you can see from the outside, has a huge power. It's a power that will invest the viewer with terror, with awe, with complete splendor. And you can see the tiny figures in front of this extraordinarily huge monument. But the monument was not just a solid sphere, it was also a teaching monument, because in the holes of the dome there were openings that let the light in the pattern of the stars. So when you came in, this was like coming into a monument that demonstrated to you, especially school children, that demonstrated the patterns of the stars and the organization of the universe as Newton had discovered it. So the whole effect of darkness and light was being constructed through this monument. And you can see here a much more detailed of this watercolor, this monochrome watercolor of the tomb, celebrating Newton, very tiny in the huge dome, which represented the constellations of the stars. And where did Boulez get this from? Where did he draw his interest in this this idea of the sublime? It was from a recently translated book by the English philosopher Edmund Burke, A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful, 1757. In translation, Indagine sull'origine delle nostre idee di sublime e di bello. And there, Burke, for the first time, demonstrated that all art did not have to be beautiful, that all art could also be, in his terms, sublime and be provoking of the most extraordinarily powerful emotions. The question of the terrible, the question of terror, the question of obscurity, the question of size of dimension, the question of privation, the question of seeming infinity. All these senses that one had in nature, in raw nature, from volcanoes to forests to the immensities of the sea, could be seen as aesthetic sensations, which Burke called the sublime, where the uniformity and succession of elements, the hugeness of elements, light, the brilliance of the sun's light, the darkness, the shift between light and obscurity, light and darkness, would all render the works of poetry, the works of literature, the works of painting, and for Boulez, the works of architecture, sublime. And Boulez, in his Temple of Nature, for example, will give us a sense of the dome of the heavens, and once we cut through it, give us also a sense of the immensity and depth and obscurity of the earth itself. Not just to develop questions of terror, but also questions of awe, questions of respect. The sublime could be used for Boulez to develop a whole new project for one of the new institutions of the late 18th century, the public library, public library, which Boulay was asked to develop a plan for in the 1780s on the basis of the Royal Collection of Books, which was expanding so quickly that they needed a new library in order to house them. And so Boulay took the idea not from any previous public library, but from a painting. He went to what he felt was the most sublime painting of knowledge that he could find, which was Raphael's Scuola di Atene, or School of Athens, that is Plato's, an image by Raphael of Plato's Academy, which is obviously, as you know, is in the Vatican, in the Stanza di Raffaello. And you can see here Plato here pointing to the sky next to his student Aristotle, with all the philosophers that came after Plato, all the geographers, the literary figures, and the thinkers and the scientists that came after Plato and came out of Plato's Academy, imagined by Raphael here as a huge series of triumphal arches, and then developed. There's Plato on the left and Aristotle on the right. Plato looking to the heavens and Aristotle saying looking to the earth, between the earth and the heavens. You can see the various details, Michelangelo with his own portrait there, a Piranesi version of this, which obviously also Boulay looked at, an image of the Egyptian library, and then Boulay looking at the courtyard of the royal library, the royal palace, and thinking one of the cheapest ways of dealing with this library would be to roof it over, simply to roof over the courtyard and fill the courtyard with the stacks of books. And you can see here that extraordinary image, the sublime image of knowledge that Boulay developed out of a painting into architecture, and out of architecture into a sense of the sublimity of knowledge and the depth and the extraordinary visions of knowledge that the Enlightenment had brought all the way back to antiquity. Out of Plato and Plato's Academy came Boulay's library, the Royal Library of France. And here you see the entrance to that library with the two figures of Atlas holding up the knowledge of the world, and even seeing the facade of the library as a book with inscriptions on it, as if these were pages. The walls themselves were inscribed with letters, as if they were books holding up the library. Of course, if you know the new National Library by Dominique Perrault in Paris, you'll know that he also had read Boulay and had followed Boulay by constructing his new National Library with a great central courtyard full of plants, surrounded by 4 towers, each one in an L shape, the shape of open books. So we have 4 open books surrounding a courtyard, very much emulating the work of the late 18th century architect Boulay. But his most powerful paintings of architecture came when, after the Revolution and during that period of the Terror, where Robespierre and his Committee of Public Safety were indulging in the execution of aristocrats and everybody who had, including the king and the queen, supported the monarchy. Boulez began to imagine a whole series of tombs and of an architecture of tombs. The notion that you could have an architecture which expressed death, the most terrifying of all emotions that Burke had described. And we have an architecture in muraglia del tutto, nuda e spoglio, the notion of a sepulchral architecture, an architecture that was stripped of all decoration in an effort to demonstrate its absolute tomb-like nature, and of course, evoking the tombs of Egypt, and in those tombs themselves evoking the heavens and the depths of the earth. The extraordinary paintings of Boulez, which always set his architectural inventions pure geometry, yes, but a rationalist geometry, which is, as Rossi said, an exalted, esalto geometry, set in the storms and the weather of all the elements, the power of the natural elements, giving a terribilità to the architecture of death, including images of the rebuilt Tower of Babel, images of cemeteries that were so dark as to be almost invisible, images of cemeteries that are so full of precise and knife-cutting geometry, they seem as though they're emulating the guillotine itself, but also smashed with rain and clouds, and the I always think of Boulez as an architect of very bad weather. Here we have another image of a tomb, and then the final image where he's walking in a wood and next to his house in the moonlight, and he sees his shadow cast on the ground by the moon, and sees himself in a way as an image of death. The terra spoglia offre una sepolcro universale. And this kind of architecture, an architecture of shadows, where he's speaking of an architecture which is built out of a material that absorbs the light, completely absorbent material, with shadows incised in that material in order to make an architecture of shadows. And this is his vision of a temple where he has one kind of frame built out of absorbent material, a light absorbent material. You can't even see the material itself, and in that material is cut another temple, which is the temple he's speaking about, is the temple of shadows, composed entirely of black shadows. And that for him is the most sublime of all monuments. So now I want to turn to a more cheerful architect, an architect who built a lot more than Boulez, a contemporary of Boulez, slightly younger, about 8 years younger, Claude-Nicolas Ledoux, who left a series of buildings. A lot of buildings still exist, including a salt factory that he built near Besançon in an extraordinary semicircular plan. He built a whole series of toll gates around Paris, the barrières de Paris, many of which still exist, a few and a lot of large chateaux and private houses, many of the private houses that he built for aristocrats and high performers, artists and dancers in the city of Paris have been demolished through the development of Paris. But you can see here in his self-portrait, he is totally interested in engraving. He was trained as an engraver, and as a student, he used his talents as an engraver to earn money while he was going to architecture school. And you can see that he is using all the talents of shading, of drawing, of engraving in this enlarged version of his book, L'Architecture, a book that is several hundred pages long, an extraordinary text of almost a utopian, almost a utopia text that I can't go into this afternoon, but at the same time is full of his images in writing of paintings and engravings that in the end are the inspiration for his books. Here is the frontispiece. I gave you that enlarged version of his self-portrait, but here he is giving us a kind of antique frontispiece to his book, so that we are in fact penetrating the kind of mystery of going behind this title, architecture, considered in relationship to art, mores, that's society, and legislation. The first architectural work, monograph, to be developed by an architect that in its title deals with the relationship between architecture and society. And accordingly, he will develop engraving after engraving, hundreds of engravings in this work. Many of them, of course, not done by him, but done by engravers under his supervision. Here are some of the plates from the Encyclopédie, the great encyclopedia of the 1750s, showing how the engraving workshops worked. Here are the tools of the engraver and the ways in which those tools can begin to develop different forms of hatching and different forms of representation. And here is an unfinished engraving of Ledoux. Part of it has already been engraved, and the rest of it he's sketching in to give the engraver the next stage of background, so that the engraver can follow through. So here you get a sense of the process by which an engraving is built up in a series of stages. The engraver will pull the print, will show the print to the architect. The architect will then sketch on the print. The print is then taken back to the copper plate, which then is redone according to the architect's description. And here we have some of the extraordinary engravings in Ledoux's architecture, in his work. A play on the bridge of boats, that bridge of boats, which was such a common device in the army, but now Ledoux, in his idealization of the bridge of boats, giving us a sense of these bridge of boats are no longer war boats, but they are swans. But he is taking this, and in his relationship to engraving, he is looking at all the engravings in the encyclopedia of the various structures and forms of everyday life. So if you compare this engraving with the engraving of the military bridge of boats in the encyclopedia, you will see that he's moving from reality into ideal through his own techniques of engraving. Or he will use the engraving in order to develop a whole series of ideal monuments based on geometry. And here you see the difference between Ledoux and Boulez. Ledoux also has a sense of the sublime, but his sublime is based in abstraction, is based in pure geometry, is based in the pure cubic geometry of the Enlightenment, is based in rationalism. And as we saw Rossi talking about Boulez's exalted rationalism, Rossi will also speak about the conventional and geometrical rationalism of Ledoux. So Ledoux is, in the end, much more of an architect, much more of an engraver, much less of a painter than Boulez. Here, a house for a charcoal burner. You can see him bringing wood to the fire here, and here the charcoal burners practices how they burn charcoal in pyres, developed as a plate in the encyclopedia. So Ledoux is taking the form of everyday life and turning it into geometry and making a geometrical element for the building up of his ideal city. Here, a double-barreled house for the house of the barrel makers. This is the barrel making for the encyclopedia, and this is the house for the barrel makers that Ledoux designs for them. Here, a factory for developing armaments and the forges of that have recently been developed in England, and here the actual design of those forges again as they were in the encyclopedia. So we see Ledoux taking an engraving from the encyclopedia and turning it into the architecture of idealization for his ideal city. And here, in parallel to Boulez, but in a domestic level, this is no longer a great monument to Newton, but it is a house for shepherds, because after all, as he shows in this engraving, the sun, which is spherical, lights the earth and nurtures the earth. The shepherds nurture and look after their flocks, and they have to live then in an emulation of the sun, or in a much more universal scale, print that Ledoux develops from his study of astronomy in the late 18th century, the different developments in astronomy that have discovered the moons around Venus and Saturn, have discovered patterns on the moon itself. Here the globe, and here some of the engravings in the encyclopedia, from which Ledoux took his engraved version of the universe, and here he's taking the sphere of the Earth in his cosmological diagram and turning it into a half-buried sphere, which is the cemetery of his ideal city. So again, the play between painting and architecture of Boulez, developing a kind of atmospheric architecture, and the engraving and architecture of Ledoux, developing an architecture of precision and geometry, an architecture that was thought by many in the 1920s, the era of Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, and Adolf Loos, to have anticipated in its abstract geometry the abstract geometries of modernity. So Boulez, Ledoux. There were also artists who developed notions of architecture. David, one of the young friends, a painter and a young friend of Ledoux, who may have actually saved Ledoux from being executed during the Terror, himself interested in architecture, when he stays in the French Academy in Rome in the 1740s, drawing Roman architecture, but also inventing architecture for himself, inventing an Etruscan architecture, an architecture of Etrusco, the Etruscan order, simply by combining the Doric with the Tuscan and making a new form of architecture here in his oath of the Orazii. And Ledoux himself, a friend of David, developing from David's architecture a new form of classical architecture towards the end of his life. You can see here the various ways in which Ledoux wished to follow the painting of David in the 1800s. David, whose death of Socrates here just before the French Revolution, shows an architecture of absolute abstraction, an architecture of absolute cauchery architecture, which very much parallels the architecture of death of Boulez. And here in the Brutus painting, the emergence again of Etruscan architecture, the Etruscan order that David developed towards the French Revolution. The third architect that could be talked about, I will not talk about him today, Jean-Jacques Lecoeur, because your professor, Professor Baeri, has written very recently an extraordinary work on the architecture and drawing of Boulez. I just wanted to illustrate him in a third form of architects and painting. So we have Boulez as the architect painter of the sublime, Ledoux as the architect engraver of geometry, and Lecoeur as not a professional architect, but a draftsman. Lecoeur, who learned all the techniques of draftsmanship and copied from all the engravings and drawings that he knew, and was trained as a draftsman, worked obviously in the early, just before the end of the French Revolution, in the atelier of Soufflot, and for much of his life worked in the department of maps and cartography of Napoleon's bureaucracy in the early 1800s. But here you have his illustration of the techniques and instruments of draftsmanship. This is not a painter. This is not an engraver. This is a professional draftsman who is interested in the tools of drafting, interested in the ways in which those tools can construct forms. Here we have how the pantograph can actually construct the form of the lip, the mouth, and the chin, how draftsmanship can imagine, and Professor Boeri has described this particular image in great detail in her recent book, so I won't go into it, but he imagines all kinds of scenes, but scenes that are not as Boulez set in nature, not as Ledoux engraved, but painted as draftsmanship sections through actual buildings. So it's as if this building has already been built, has been cut through and given a section, or in cartography, the notion of precise organization of the landscape, or in the representation of presumably his domestic cat, the sense of literal representation of nature. So Jean-Jacques Lecoeur then more a draftsman than a painter, less an engraver and than Ledoux. We shift almost in the same period to Germany and to the circle of Carl Friedrich Schinkel and to another painter, Caspar David Friedrich, who is a painter of the sublime. Burke had been translated into German, and everyone was understanding the possibilities of developing painting that could appeal to the deepest and most terrifying emotions. Here, the emotions of the ruined abbey and the emotions of the ruined trees. So nature and art are ruined within the eternal flux of nature, and given a representation of terror, of the terror of time, the terror of history, the terror of decay. And here in the Monk am Meer, or the monk by the sea, the monaco in riva al mare, a sense of the infinity of the sea, the infinity of the sky, the solitary nature of the individual, the aloneness of the individual, the terror of infinity, as Burke would say, imaged in Caspar David Friedrich's painting. Schinkel, who was a colleague and friend of Caspar David Friedrich in Berlin, will also have aspirations to be a painter. Here in his self-portrait, you can see almost he wants to give us the sense of himself as a visionary with his penetrating eyes, and he will draw and paint his way through Italy. Here, drawing a little farmhouse in Sicily, surrounded by nature, the relationship between a simple farmhouse and nature, the relationship between a Gothic cathedral and the society that the Gothic cathedral was built by, this notion of the sublimity of history. So what we find now is not simply the sublimity of simple terror, simple awe, the sublimity of death, the sublimity of experience. We find in the early 19th century a sense of the sublimity of history. Why? Because the depth of time, the infinity of time going way, way back, and also the terror of the future. So we have ourselves poised at the beginning of the 19th century in a moment of historical transformation, where revolution in France and Germany had brought about new states, had brought about the fall of monarchies, where history stretched behind and the future stretched in front in an unknown void. We stood like the monk on the sea, alone, not just in nature, but also in time, the sublimity of temporal depth. And here we have the notion of the panorama. Panorama, of course, which moves from left to right in time. You have to turn your eyes. You're moving from nature to the ruins of nature, to the imitation of those ruins of nature, almost growing into Gothic. So we have here Schinkel's allegory of the notion of an architecture that emerges out of nature, and the Gothic architecture of the Middle Ages actually emerging as a not just an imitation, but almost organically coming out of the ruins of nature itself, or and of course his early Gothic buildings in Berlin, or another panorama showing his relationship to antiquity, showing antiquity being built. It's not just a static temple, it's a temple being built up in a landscape of temples out of nature, out of an anti-landscape, out of a culture, out of society, out of a spirit of the age that builds and builds for the future. So we have here the beginnings of the temple and the ends of the temple, and in between the process that has built the temple. Always that sense of process in architecture. And we have here a detail of that painting, and a detail of one of his illustrations of antique landscapes, where not only is he drawing the temple, but he's also painting the sacrificial bull being taken to the temple surrounded by its life, inhabited by life. And so we get a sense of architecture organically emerging out of life through the painting of temporality, through the painting of panoramas, and his own sense of the history of architecture emerging in the same way from simple blocks of stone all the way through to arches, and his building of the Neue Wache in Berlin, where he illustrates the temple itself emerging out of a block of stone. Here, the two pylons, which imitate the first stones erected in nature, and the temple itself emerging out of those pylons as a sort of organic burst of antique power. And there, his version of the Neue Wache in a photograph that I took to emulate its sublime nature. To England, to John Soane, and who was not a painter, but who became very close friends and supporters of a painter. Gandhi was someone who all his life worked for Soane, illustrating Soane's buildings in the way that Soane, the architect, wanted them illustrated. I give you just one particular example. Here, Soane's plan, he drew up between 1788 to 1833 of the labyrinth of the different halls, the different rooms of the Bank of England, each one of which is constructed according to Soane's imitation of a Roman room. You see here one of the major banking rooms, again painted by Gandhi, showing it far bigger than it actually was, in order to give a kind of sense of the sublimity and power of banking. Another of the rooms before it's inhabited by Gandhi, showing again the way in which the Pantheon is now brought into the banking hall, with, of course, that symbol of time, the clock, stuck to the walls of the Pantheon. The model of the Bank of England presented by Soane to the bank. Here, Gandhi's painting of that model, and then an extraordinary painting that Gandhi proposed to demonstrate. Now, this is something that if you are going to be in any way architects, you should begin to take this to heart. Gandhi is demonstrating to the Bank of England that if they built the building that John Soane had just designed, if they built this, in 2,000 years, it would look as good as the ruins of Rome. So it demonstrates to the client that even if his building fell into ruins, it would look great, and it would look just like Rome. So this is how an architect and a painter can work together to deal with time, to deal with the future, to deal with the terror of the future. You can actually anticipate the future by ruining the design that you've just made in order to demonstrate that it will make a good ruin. And finally, to Aldo Rossi here, standing between the columns of the Parthenon, standing very proudly in his architectural garb, and the way in which his work, l'architettura della città of 1966, will take the 18th century, will take these works that I've shown, Boulez, Ledoux, and an 18th century architect, Milizia, as the basis for his own form of architectural typology in the Palazzo Comunale in Scandicci in 1970, and very powerfully, of course, in the cemetery, San Cataldo, where the painting of the cemetery becomes as powerful. And of course, this painting was with many others of the same kind, finished many years before the actual cemetery was built, and became an image that circulated through the world, an image of the way in which Aldo Rossi would take from the 18th century and transform the 18th century into a form of neo-rationalismo, of not rationalism, but neo-rationalism, demonstrated in his exhibition at the Milan Triennale of 1973, where he will develop a whole theory of neo-rationalism out of the 18th century, out of his translation 1 year earlier of Boulez, an exalted version of modernism. In other words, for him, the rationalism of the 18th century, transformed by Boulez into an exalted rationalism, will become for him a way of transforming modernism, the geometrical modernism of Le Corbusier and others in the 1920s, into an exalted form of modernism, bringing together the two in painting. And so it is through painting that I would hold that actually Rossi brings his architecture to a perfect state in a way that the actual buildings themselves may not always give you that sense of a sublime experience. So there we are. I end with one image which is not sublime at all, which is the difference between someone who is entering into the spirit of the past and remaking it for the present in a new form, and someone who is just copying the past in a very banal and abstract way. The Philip Johnson imitating the outer shell of Ledoux's school in order to build a faculty of architecture in Houston. That's it.